In this simple example, we're going to investigate App Connect Enterprise's ability to send out OpenTelemetry data when using the Kafka Transport. We're going to use two different message flows, one which is a KafkaProducerFlow and the other one's a KafkaConsumer. In this case of the Kafka Producer, we're driving the traffic through HTTP. We're then doing a very simple piece of transformation logic to uppercase a particular field. And then the Kafka Producer node is writing a message to the Kafka topic on event streams, which happens to be called topic 3. And we have a policy document defined that describes the relationship with Kafka. We don't really need to dive into too many of the details here, but we note that we're using SASL SSL as a secure protocol. We've got the name of a bootstrap server we're talking to. We have a trust store set up, and we also have a certificate that's been placed in the right file system location. We can see inside the external directory vault we have multiple credentials that are being used here. We're going to a schema registry, we're communicating with Slack later in this example as well, and all of these credentials have already been defined, ready for us to use. The last stage of the producer flow sends a response back over HTTP to the requesting client, and again we'll see that in action later. The second message flow is driven from a KafkaConsumer node that reads from the same topic that we just wrote to with the first message flow. We then have a compute node to do some basic setting up of a file name. We have a log node to make an entry into the activity log that we'll be looking at later after the flow has executed. We then write out a file, a very simple output message. Having taken the data from Kafka, we write it to a file, and then ultimately we send a very brief Slack message into a channel to alert the user what has happened. So having seen at a high level what the flows do, we're going to place both the message flows that we've talked about into recording mode. But before we inject data through those flows, we're going to go off to a web browser and just look at the state of the other systems before we start putting any data through. And we're going to begin that by looking at the event streams web UI here. So we have a list of topics, and if we navigate into topic 3, we can see that there's been some prior messages written to this topic, and so far we're up to offset number 36. So we're just going to keep a memory of that number so that when we put new data through, we'll see that extra messages have been written to the topic. We also have here the Jaeger web UI, and I can do a search for traces that have occurred within the last 5 minutes. And unsurprisingly, at the moment, there are no trace results. We haven't put data through, but again, that's going to change in just a moment. So we're going to start by injecting a very simple JSON message. You can see the last name field there is the one we're going to uppercase. And we've received a message back, and we've done that very simple manipulation. We've concatenated a couple of fields together and uppercased the response. This demonstration isn't really about the transform nature, it's really more about the transports and the OpenTelemetry feature. So if we skip straight to the second flow and examine the path that was taken by the data as it went through that flow, we can then look at what the various stages have actually done for us. If we start life by looking at what logging has occurred and switch into the web browser interface for ACE, we can navigate into the consumer flows activity log, fetch the activity log back again and look at what the flow has done. So we began by waiting for an input from the Kafka consumer. We then received a message from the Kafka server, and we then triggered the message flow, wrote a file in the output directory, and we ultimately appended that there, and then we finally invoked the Slack connector as well. So several different stages that we've gone through, and all of those have been logged for us, courtesy of the flow's behavior. If we look at the file output node, we can now find that a file has been written. And if we open up that file, we can look at some of the information that's been placed inside of it. This is demonstrating the ability of a compute node to access things like the OpenTelemetry trace ID, the trace parent, the trace state, and the span ID as well. So this is if you want to extend your message flows to exploit OpenTelemetry data yourself, you can get access to that within a compute node that we've just chosen to copy into the output file. And at the very end of the message flow, we've also written a message to Slack. So you can see the App Connect Enterprise here a couple of minutes ago has written an output file now that we've gone through that entire flow. So we've got some good diagnostics about what's going on. But if we go and look into the OpenTelemetry Jaeger web UI here, we can see that now there is a new span that's been generated. The data has gone through several different applications here. And the first two blue lines relate to the behavior of the producer flow, but we're actually more interested today in what's gone on with the consumer side of the rearrangement. And you can see here this very long turquoise bar is representing several seconds that have been spent inside that second message flow. And at the very end of the flow, again, another new feature there, we can see the time spent inside the Slack request discovery connector. So if we were in real life here, we'd try and look at what's going on in this flow. And this suspicious smoking gun here is what's happening with the user's logic inside this compute node. The log and the file write should be relatively rapid. And so let's look at the user's code here. Oh dear, yep. Sure enough, something's gone wrong here. Very suspicious, particularly given this is a demo. What this developer has actually done is he's written a sleep statement right in the middle of his ESQL code. Goodness only knows why that happened, and of course this is just a silly example. There could have been a longer loop there, or some code that could have been written in a more performant way. But a sleep statement's pretty easy to fix. I can just comment that out, resave the ESQL file, and then we can run the test through again, having diagnosed and fixed our problem. So if we take the Kafka application, we can drag and drop that back down onto the same test server. And once the deployment completes, we can then put the flow back into a testing mode in order to exercise it a second time around with the same data. And we're going to then go in to see how that's impacted the OpenTelemetry traces that have been gathered through the product, having put the data through. So again, we'll use the flow exerciser here. We'll send in the same data, and sure enough, we have that coming back to us with the upper casing having been applied. And if we go straight back to the web user interface here, now we have the extra trace that's come through. And sure enough, if we look at the time scales on this data, we've now got a very tiny turquoise bar at the bottom right there. Most of the time now inside that flow has been sent inside the Slack request node, and sure enough, we've fixed our code as a result of the OpenTelemetry.